everyone, and welcome to Gerg and Muxl, a podcast that seeks to explore the unexplored topics in games. Not gaming.
Gaming.
It's way different how they work, why they work, and why we love them.
You're right, that doesn't work for gaming.
I know. We are going to be doing a kind of something closer to what we did originally, which was the roots of the podcast, where Mark and I just talking when he was living across the country about something that we found interesting in games. Yeah, we're going to talk through it and hopefully come to some conclusions. It was born out of Video Game Donkey and some of his videos, actually, in a roundabout way. But also from my Arkham playing lately.
And just from trends in the gaming industry currently.
Yeah.
The video that he's referencing is the E3, the look ahead to 2018.
Right.
And several other videos that have sort of discussed this idea of having like cinematic moments in games. I don't necessarily mean cutscenes, but for example, the Arkham combat you referenced a lot, which was you can make a very minor input and you can do something that looks really cool, and somebody who doesn't know how these games play might think, wow, that was a really complicated thing that you just did. But in reality, you're sort of giving timed inputs, and there's certainly some skill in playing, but it doesn't really parallel what's happening on screen.
Yeah, what's interesting, one of the common critiques of the Arkham series, and not just the Arkham series, but as we'll talk about here, a lot of games moving forward, or currently kind of modern games, is kind of the like press X to save the world prompts, where you come up to something and it says like press X to do this really complex task.
Right.
Which back in the day used to be like that was a game, was like doing the complex task, right?
Mm-hmm.
There'd be different levels, and games have gotten so much more advanced and complex now that I think there's a number of reasons for it, but it really does give you cinematic moments that it was challenging for me to even think about the fact that movies and games are very different mediums, and being so narrative driven and story based as I am, like in games like that, those tend to be, there's a level of you have to be on the rails for that to work.
Right.
And they do tend more toward cinema than games. I think games at core aren't the ideal optimal storytelling medium.
No.
In a lot of ways. I think there are some really cool things that games can do for story that movies can't do, but at the same time, I think games, particularly if you look at their roots and just the idea of interactive media, by default, that has to mean that there's got to be a level of choice and input from the player, which makes a good story really hard to tell. So anyway, all this to say, as I think, just thinking about it, I think as technology has progressed, particularly with games, because I remember being a kid and thinking like the pinnacle of video games would be playing a movie, like where you couldn't tell the difference between real life.
Yeah. And
we're like kind of getting like there's I remember there's been some shots of stuff where it's in engine stuff where I like had to like, usually it's a screenshot as opposed to like something, but it's just the rendered game, and I'm like I have to double check if it was a shot or not.
Yeah.
Like it was real or not. So we're kind of getting there. And I think a side effect of that added ability to be cinematic is trying to give cinematic moments, which Batman, for instance, one of them would be a really simple, like hacking. To activate something, you have to pull out a wireless hacking device and you hack it, and it's really, really simple. Mm-hmm. And it's close to press X for hack. Or even like, there's a literal one where you have to find, it's like press X to decode. Like you hold down X and it'll like be decoding this like encrypted signal, and then you can listen in on it. Like you can build an entire game around, like a hacking game.
Yeah,
you can build,
decoding the signal.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And there are entire games like that. And back when when technology didn't allow you to do anything other than one thing at a time, you know, like that was like the whole game. The idea of trying to make a game where that was just a sub part that you could just reduce to one input wasn't even possible, because you didn't have the resources, you didn't have the complexity in the systems, you didn't have the groundwork in game engines to be able to build something like Arkham.
Right, you couldn't convey it visually.
No,
really.
Lord no.
You couldn't. I mean, you could say like you hacked the system,
right.
And it would just be like a sentence. It would be kind of unsatisfying. Yeah.
But now we can do that. So hence, to give you those feelings of adequacy as Batman, who would be easy to hack. This gets into some conversations about simulation as well.
Sure.
And empowerment versus the actual gameplay. You know, I think that's going to be an important point too, is like empowerment, because like, so one good example that was brought up as a negative side of this, where being less, being more cinematic can really detract from gameplay, was the comparisons between the old Medal of Honor games and the current Call of Duty World War II that was just released. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, well, but first I wanted to mention, you have to appreciate the sort of dilemma that game designers are in with the increased fidelity in games. You have a increase in the detail of the world and everything that you can display on the screen, which has not been paralleled by an increase in control complexity.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh,
You're using the exact same controls you've been using. A couple of joysticks since the PlayStation 2. You've been having a couple joysticks under your thumbs for a decade or more at this point.
Easy.
And so it's not clear how you interact with a more detailed world, and it seems to be right now the way the industry is going is they'll interact with it for you.
Yeah.
You press one button and they'll do all the cool things like grab the guy by his shirt collar and pull him close to you. There's no way you can have a level of input that fine to say I would like to grab the shirt collar.
Yeah, and that's what I was trying to get at earlier with the hacking thing, which is games weren't complex enough. No one was thinking in those terms where you could even do something that specific in a game.
Right.
You had 4 commands, and they would map to the 4 things you could do.
Mm-hmm.
So hence, trying to think of a game like Arkham or GTA 5 or something, or Red Dead, these crazy versions of reality where you can do these really complex, amazing things. You couldn't do any. Look at old art.
I mean, that's why Mario will jumps on things.
Yeah.
Right? It's because it's literally... It's the clearest way to telegraph that you're attacking something.
Mm-hmm.
If you think about a punch, if you're far away, it's hard to tell if somebody punches somebody else.
Yeah.
But if somebody jumps on top of someone else, you can tell, no matter how far away you are.
It's this complete overlap of the characters.
Exactly.
That's the only is the... just having a border between... defining anything is that's the easiest way. Anyway, point is, what you're saying with that, as actions, things you can do in games have gotten more complex, your controls haven't. So that has... I think that's a great insight in terms of why that might be happening on top of it. But, you want to talk about the World War II thing, too?
Yeah.
Because that was a great... I loved that point.
So this was
and I have a thought about that as well.
This was a great point, actually inspired by a Hugbox video. And it is that the Medal of Honor franchise did a Storming the Beach of Normandy part of their game, and so did the most recent Call of Duty. And the latter has a much more cinematic feel to it. It's obviously much more realistic in terms graphically, visually. But it takes control away from the player a good portion of the mission. And for this reason feels less tense, actually, because you're not really in charge of keeping yourself alive from the beach all the way to the seawall. You get to have your hands off the controls a lot. So in the early Medal of Honor game, you get to be much more in charge of how the assault plays out. You get to duck for cover, you get to watch the other people around you get mowed down, and you're still in control at that point. So you have every reason to believe that you could be next.
By fire that could mow you down as well, actually.
Exactly.
So, the same guns are firing and having an effect on the world that if you get hit by those bullets, that they would kill you as well.
You're not being taken out of frame into this, oh, I know that I'm protected because it's a cutscene.
Right, because it's something's playing right now.
Because the game would never kill me during a cutscene, because that would, that would be stupid.
That would be really lame,
know that there's no way you're going to die. What you said at the beginning of the episode, Greg, even about, the difference between stories and games, it's interesting that, the stories, the things that seem to work the best in video games are the stories that people already know. Right? So, you can get people to play a story in a game, but they have to already be bought into playing that story.
Right.
So, if somebody already knows the story of Spider-Man, or Batman, or Storming the Beach of Normandy, it's a lot easier to get them to just buy into that, because they know what they're supposed to do. They know the role that they have to play.
Sure.
If you're trying to unveil and show a new story to somebody, it's harder to get the player to cooperate with that, because they don't really know the story. They're learning it right now.
Sure.
And so to the degree that they already know the story, they're going to be able to sort of be their own rails, and you don't have to put in a bunch of artificial game-breaking or immersion-breaking stuff that's going to constantly tell the player, hey, you're not doing the thing you're supposed to be doing.
Yeah, and there's also a level of a merging of gameplay and cinematic value with for the Normandy example, where the artificial rails in the Normandy are just you die if you don't do the correct thing, which is exactly what the game is supposed to be, as well as what Normandy was.
Right.
To a certain extent. There's also a level of deep luck, so I don't want to... Anyway, point is, So it wasn't like the trying to force you to storm the beach on Normandy wasn't like it wasn't really that was the only option, similar to how that would be the only option in real life. So that was an easy one. The thing that I thought was interesting about the Normandy example, right? Because like you said, the Call of Duty one was like in large part like a cutscene. You'd like run forward with what appeared to be no chance of dying until you reach another place where you have another cutscene, and then there's another cutscene, and then you're like have a beachhead, and then you're like fighting. Right. As opposed to like you said, you get off the boat in the original one and have to take cover in between. What do they call those big, huge barriers that they had in the water?
Yeah,
huge X's.
I don't know what
those things. You had to take cover between those. Like you said, there was active fire that was coming through. You could actually die. I remember playing that actually. It was Allied Assault, way back in the day. But the interesting thing that I was thinking for that example was the level of, and just as well as applied to other games, we talk about empowerment a lot and wish fulfillment and fantasy being a huge draw of games and the way they can make you feel. And in the Normandy example, it is a supremely powerless. That is not a horribly empowered. No one wants to live that. That is like literally one of the most traumatic events in like human history.
Yeah.
And there's a reason it lives so notoriously. No one wants to live that, right? That's not a wish fulfillment. There's no level of power involved. It's complete opposite.
Oh yeah.
And yet, still having control in that situation was the superior gameplay experience, because of what that did was it gave you, like you said, tension building. It actually felt like you had some level of, outside of just the visuals and everything, it actually felt like you had some skin in the game,
right? As
opposed to the Medal of Honor one.
You gave them some of the experience.
Or the Call of Duty. Yeah.
You gave them some of the experience of storming the beach.
Yeah.
Obviously, nobody would want to sign up for like a full reenactment of storming the beach.
I mean, VR, man. I'm saying. No one's going to, like, again, with the horror thing, like, we will just traumatize people if it gets good enough.
Well, that's what I'm saying, is that, like, they gave them a little bit of the simulation.
Yeah.
They didn't give them the whole thing.
Yeah.
But it was, giving them a little bit was superior to not giving them anything.
Yeah, which is really interesting. Because, and as he said, the Call of Duty version was basically just a objectively inferior version of Saving Private Ryan. But, of course, with Private Ryan, there's tons of tension, too, but it's different.
Right.
It is the one that is, just reality. Like, there's very little CG that need to be done because they use tons of practical effects. This is getting to movie making, but the point being that there was all of the tension lay in experiencing what was happening.
Right.
And movies can only do that. That's the only tools they have, is letting you experience what's happening. And so they have all these different ways to try to evoke emotion. Games don't. And so hence, you can still have, I don't know if you could make the case of a similar, but a potentially comparable experience to a kid who's playing, with what at the time was groundbreaking graphics, feeling stressed playing the Normandy invasion and Medal of Honor, but with far less cinematic quote-unquote value, which is really interesting. They could get similar emotional responses.
Yeah.
Just in vastly different ways. And I think that difference between games and movies is really important. I think that's really, really telling. Going back to like the Arkham one, anyway, back to empowerment, like you said, having like a little bit of that experience, but not the entirety of it, I think is really interesting. That goes back to something we've talked about multiple times, which is most, if not all games, are not asking to be, you don't want simulation. No gamer wants that.
Nope.
And obviously with World War II, that's an easy one. But even past that, a true Batman simulator you don't want. There's a reason Batman doesn't exist. That's impossible to simulate. And so you do need a level of the game taking you and empowering you. So the press X to do this thing kind of side of it, if we're looking at it as a spectrum, that seems to be potentially far more empowering.
Yeah.
Right? Where you have almost the minimal amount of input possible, which is, it's not a cutscene, but you have to do something, and pressing it does it. Or a very simple control, right? And then something that you wouldn't be able to do otherwise, or something that's too complex to have an entire control system built around it, happens, right? Like for Batman, like, I don't even know how you'd go about trying to, outside of, like, basically VR controls, like motion controls, I don't know how you begin possibly trying to specifically map out a way to control his body.
Right.
As opposed to control what he does. Right?
Like in a higher level.
Yeah.
Like run or drive or
something.
Like
the way you're able
to...
to...
Major activities you can do with a controller.
Right.
But,
or like actual combat, right? Like moving his arm up to block an attack that you see coming.
Right.
There's a button for that. It's triangle. It's counter. If you see an attack coming, no matter what the attack is, in any way, shape, or form, you press triangle at the right time, Batman will block it correctly.
Right. And
there's no quote-unquote skill involved there outside of the timing of the combat. But that's the thing, is that they built a system where that isn't... There's still complexity in the system. It's just not what it used to be.
Well, they've sort of built an abstraction around combat.
Yeah.
Right? Like, so they don't expect you to, say, be able to communicate to Batman in a timely fashion, block with your right arm.
Right.
That's just, well, block. I don't know,
right.
Whatever's happening on the screen right now, please block.
Yeah.
And then Batman will translate that into whatever he has to do to block the move.
Which I maintain is, just specifically about Arkham, or even the Arkham combat system, which has kind of gotten co-opted a little bit in terms of other third-person combat, like the Shadows of Mordor, or even Assassin's Creed has kind of creeped into, to a certain extent, PS4 Spider-Man, which actually I have, by the way.
Oh, great.
I just got that for super cheap.
Nice.
$20. All of those games have a system where the animation, basically like the presentation, the animation, the cinematic quality of those games is so high, and it gets flack for the difference between the level of complexity that you're seeing on the screen. Mm-hmm. Maybe this is it. The level of complexity of what you're seeing happen on the screen versus the complexity of what you have to do with your controller, mm-hmm. your input as a character.
Right.
And if there's a big divide there, people get angry, and it feels cheap.
Mm-hmm.
There's a level, though, like I said previously, like if you took away the level of complexity of what was happening on the screen, the system, the combat system of those games, you reduce them all to like, ones and zeros, or just like take away all the flash and all the animation. You just have like motion, right? You just have like blocks moving around.
Sure.
And timings and stuff having to happen. That, which is like kind of what games used to be, right?
Mm-hmm.
Plus or minus a few pixels. That game that they put, the combat system, quote unquote, game itself, I still maintain it's really, really good. It's really simple, but there's a lot of depth and complexity to it.
Right.
In terms of the different ways that different enemy types, different ways that you have to use it, even just the skill involved in terms of the timing and the amount of information coming in, and how to do that well. Much less like just survive it, much less do it well. Which is another part of the game. So all that is to say, I think that level of that system is still good, just because when you hit two buttons together and then Batman does this really complex takedown, which is basically an insta-kill, like that trope in games, which is like do something well enough till you get power up and you get a more powerful version of the thing you were doing, that's existed forever.
Right.
And no one was ever angry about it because we didn't have the ability to make it more complex than it was.
Right, and now it looks like it's more complex, but it isn't actually.
Yeah, exactly. If you think of it in terms of like what's actually happening in the game, I would maintain the control schemes well. I don't know. I think it looks simple, but I think there's actually a lot of combat systems are pretty simple at core, and have depth to them.
So one thing that you mentioned earlier is that like the combat system still. It's interesting still, right? Like it's not. It isn't just like press X to kill everyone around you, right? It's like there is still different buttons and different timings, and whether or not it is a sufficient level of difficulty is kind of up to the gamer.
Right.
But I think there is an element of like wanting to have people sort of earn the feeling of being empowered.
Yeah, totally.
Right? Like like start turning on a game and then pressing X to watch it play is not empowering.
Yeah.
It isn't like, wow, look at me, I started this whole game by pressing X.
Yeah.
It doesn't feel like that. It feels like
it's a movie, right?
This is stupid.
You press play.
Exactly.
No, totally. I think that's an interesting thing, like you said, like the you part of that has to be involved.
Mm-hmm.
And how much of that, like, you have to feel like Batman. Why, like, does watching The Dark Knight make you feel like Batman? No.
No, not really.
It gives you like an incredible sense of Batman.
Nobody said that really about The Dark Knight.
No, that was never something that people loved about it, or no one said that about any movie.
Mm-hmm. Makes
because
you
that's not
like the main
yeah, exactly, right? Maybe that's not the point.
Yeah.
Unless it's a movie where that's the point. But that's usually not the point.
No, you're right. But so you have this weird tension of like how much does the player need to be involved, and like how much does what the player's doing have to mirror what's happening on screen in terms of the level of complexity? Because if Batman's over here doing backflips and I'm just hitting Y on my controller, do I feel like that's
right.
is that congruent enough for me to feel empowered, or is it so completely different that I just feel like I'm not participating?
And then the real bitch of it is, as a developer, is like, okay, it's fine. Do you have to hit XX to jump twice, like a different combination, or is it like a half turn and then two X's? Well, then, or is that too much? Is that too complicated now?
Yeah, sure.
Or is it like a half turn XX like correctly timed.
Uh-huh.
Like what is that sweet spot? And because then eventually you get into like okay, now we're mapping stuff to limbs and body parts again, and now we're in a control scheme that doesn't actually make sense and isn't empowering at all.
Right.
But like you said,
it's confusing.
Yeah. So that's such an interesting, difficult line to draw. Which is another read. The more we talk about games, the more I'm like, glad I'm not a developer.
Well,
because I would maintain too, just as a decent thesis, which I have no idea if this is true or not, but I think part of it too is that empowerment level, which is having more control, particularly for something complex. You want to be doing something really feeling really powerful, far more powerful than you are normally, then having a little bit of differentiation between you having a little bit of that press X to do complex thing might be good.
Right.
Again, with the Norby example, there's no fantasy there. You're just a person,
right,
like yourself, and you can imagine jumping out of a boat and wading through the water.
Mm-hmm.
That's it. There's no level of empowerment that has to happen, actually.
Right.
So hence having more control over that is going to put you more into that situation and give you a better sense of what the game is trying to convey. It'll put you into the game more.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting that you can get into that in different ways.
Well, and what you're trying to do on a macro level for storming the beach in Normandy is, at least the way that the way that it was translated into the game, it was pretty straightforward. Right,
yeah,
like you need to hide behind the barriers.
Right.
You need to avoid enemy fire, and you need to provide. You need to shoot back occasionally if you are able to get close enough.
Right.
You're not really responsible for like communicating with the people around you.
Sure.
Yeah. There are lots of things about the way the cover mechanics work that aren't quite realistic. You can still get gunned down if you're behind one of those things.
Yeah.
And so that translation of the experience into the game is really where I think Medal of Honor shines in Allied Assault. But
yeah, it's imprecise too.
Right.
Like getting the experience from the player doesn't require it's like Inception almost, like reality isn't good enough. To get that feeling, if you're trying to convey, hey, desperate level of fire coming in, trying to find some cover here and there, and then getting out alive. If that's the whole thing you're trying to do, then yeah, you do have to break some rules.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of that actually wasn't what it was like in real life.
No, yeah. There was a lot more luck involved, like you said, and you wouldn't want to play a game. But you can't do that
in a game where it's just that.
You wouldn't want to play a game where you have to play through the level 30 times because there's only a 2% chance of you making it to the end.
Here's an interesting thought process. How would a assaulting Normandy, like you could do it? What if, I don't know if this would have any weight or not, but like if an opening where the same thing, it's first person, you're on a boat with your squad, It opens, and there's just random chance, different every time you play, but there's random chance involved in that way, where you might just get shot and die.
Mm-hmm.
But when that happens, you transfer over to another squad mate.
Yeah.
Point of view. Well, and you see how many people get to, you do what you can to get up. Maybe you get through on the first guy, and most of your squad dies, or not, but like, or even that could be up to the way you play a little bit, how much of your squad you can save, but you're only controlling one person at a time. But there's a level of randomness where you can just get popped, and then
you just keep going.
Yeah, and you have to, but it doesn't stop the game, right?
Well,
you don't just reload and try again.
I'm glad we came back around to this, because I think this is, I was thinking of this when we were talking about
that sounds awesome.
Film and video games, which is...
I would enjoy that.
It's incredibly hard to build tension in a video game because the player character can't die.
Yeah, sure.
And I don't mean that, like, the person that you're controlling can't die. Of course, that can happen, and you just described a game. I'm sure something similar has been done where you're kind of controlling a group of people and you switch control if they die or if something happens. What I mean by saying the player character can't die is that the player's involvement in the story cannot end.
Right, yeah.
Right? So
that's a good point.
Otherwise they're not playing the game anymore. Yeah. Like, so they always have to be a presence there.
Yeah.
In a movie, that's not the case. You can have people whose presence in the film really leaves.
Ceases entirely.
There's a real cost to having people die in the film because, well, hopefully if the storyteller has done their job, you get attached to these characters, and then you become detached if they die.
Yeah.
When you're the player character, you sort of embody a pretty vanilla shell of a person in a lot of these games because they throw you right into the action, they don't give you a lot of backstory, and it's really up to you what the actions are anyway, so why bother telling you about your character when you're the one who's controlling him anyway. Yeah. So they just kind of give you a blank slate. But then, they don't usually do a good job building up the other characters, especially in shooters.
Sure.
But So you're always going to be alive, and the person that you are is just kind of vanilla, other than it's you, the player.
An observer to
And
exist,
so,
you know?
right, and then if the person you're killing dies and you just go to somebody else, it really just seems to spread the problem.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I was thinking, which was...
Everybody around you just becomes these soulless zombies for you to animate.
Yeah, precisely. And I think that'd have to be the one time in that entire game you could ever do, like, it'd have to be really, really limited. The other thing was, like, does that cheapen, do you even care about? Because you have the meta-knowledge that if one of them dies... If the goal is to make you not want to die
Right.
and feel tension, but if you know that if you die, you just transfer to someone else, does that automatically take it away? Maybe it's literally a one-time thing. You can only do that once, and you can't know that it's going to happen as a player. And you're like, okay, that was cool, but then if you replay it, it doesn't work again, you know?
Yeah. I think it would be worth trying.
Yeah, I think it's an
experimental
interesting concept, at least. I think, too, to your... And this, what you were talking about in terms of that, your presence as a player can't cease, otherwise the game ceases, is true of most, I mean, any single-player game, certainly, or anything story-based or third or first-person. I was thinking, like, strategy games, right, like RTSs, were one of my favorites. That is different, but then you run into a whole new problem with story in RTSs because you're literally commanding everything, and again, you run into the same problem with characters because you have too much control over the characters, and too much control over the entire situation. As well as just trying to characterize people in an RTS is really hard because a single unit in RTS is not the point of an RTS game, it's the whole thing.
Yeah.
And usually stories work best with individual characters.
And I just want to be clear that, like, when you say too much control, you mean too much control in order to communicate a story effectively.
Yeah.
It becomes...
You can make them do anything you want. You make them go left, right. You lose a lot of ability to... And again, like, your actions with them are really limited, too.
The storyteller and the gamer, the player, start to inhabit almost parallel positions in the amount of control that they have over what's happening. And there's almost too many cooks in the kitchen trying to make things happen at that point.
No, yeah, precisely. And there's very little level of connection between you and the characters. Because they are literal units. RTS as a whole, I suffer from that. You said the player and the storyteller kind of combining roles, basically double dipping.
Sometimes competing, yeah.
Oh yeah, exactly.
Fighting against each other.
Yeah, precisely. In terms of if the storyline would be better served. And like, that's an RTS too, is like I said, the whole point is kind of reducing things down to single units. And you can talk about like hybrids, like Company Heroes, for example, is actually another World War II game.
There's a lot of World War II games.
Yes, but that's kind of a hybrid squad-based RTS that did quite a good job at storytelling. Because one of the good things about the RTS storytelling thing is that any character, similar to movies, any character can disappear at any point, right? It's just harder to care about those characters and characterize them and link yourself to them as a player.
Right.
Than obviously the first third-person level.
And I think that part of the reason why it's hard to care about those characters so far in gaming has been that the level of detail has been lacking.
Yeah.
Right? So intimacy is built in little moments.
Sure.
And it's really hard to convey little moments when you don't have a lot of fidelity to your medium.
Yeah. I remember... I'm sorry. I was just thinking I was trying to think of other games that have had a whole lot of detail, but very little intimacy or very little care in terms of the player experience.
Right.
And I was thinking about actually a series I love, but isn't held up as a paradigm of games, which is Killzone, the Killzone series. I played ton of 2, and I played the entire campaign of 3 a few times. But anyway, Killzone 3 ends with... Did I tell you about this? I think I did.
Maybe.
Well, the whole game... I think we've talked about this once before, but the whole game's an FPS, and the final sequence is a on-the-rails space shooting, like Star Fox sort of thing.
Oh.
And the last thing you do is... as opposed to, like, I don't know, it is literally, it says press X to launch a nuke.
Oh yeah, you did something about
and you have a nuke on your ship. And you press X and then the game ends. And there's a cutscene where a nuke drops. It's not even like you get to, like, lock on or, like, there's zero level of control to it. So you press X to turn on cutscene.
Right.
And that's, like, so deep, outside of the fact that, like I said, it was an FPS that ended, I think that was when we were talking about game endings, basically. And the weird thing where sometimes final bosses or final sequences will be entirely different genre from the entire rest of the game. which I don't fully understand. But point is that level of detail that happened in Killzone 3 was actually really extreme. It was, particularly for its time, and still looks really good, actually, in my opinion. In terms of the level of care those went into it. It's just interesting that you can put so much care and so much detail and so much, and have it be like the wrong types of care or detail to actually foster. And then the question becomes like, what was Killzone really going for a deeply involved narrative? Probably not. But at the same time, I don't know. I think there is a way to have a lot of the wrong type of detail. And not still be able to convey that level of intimacy, or like I said, like putting the player into the game-ness. Whatever that, we need a phrase for that.
Immersion.
Yes.
It's an overloaded term.
Didn't we already do that one?
We did do an episode on immersion. I think that you need to build tension in games, just like you need to build tension in movies. And there are different ways to build tension and different kinds of tension. And like the sort of tension that you feel during, Memento is very different than the sort of tension you feel during, while watching an episode of Haunting of Hill House.
Yeah.
Right? Or, which is different than if you watch This Is Us.
Right.
Right? It's like one is very relational, one is very scary and sort of trauma focused, and then the other one is like sort of a mystery. What's going on in this movie?
Right.
Why am I watching this? So,
what is happening? What is time? And who am I? Memento, maybe Memento wasn't the best example for that. It's like a genre-pushing movie by itself.
Yeah, no.
It's like a reimagined the way we could like see a narrative. But no, your point is well taken. In terms of those are different by themselves, so of course games have to be too. I'm just trying to think because I think I did experience that the bad side of on the railsness, where it did feel slightly more out of control than... I'm just trying to think of like the most tension-filled times I've had in games, outside of like horror games. Like story-based games.
Sure.
I think they tend to be stealth, where you have a lot of control over your position and where you are and what's happening. That's not a like press X to slip into this next hallway. That's just like you have to move your character in the correct timings and ways, and you have a lot of control over that particular element. I think the mirage of control that happens in games too can be interesting, right? Like the classic like QTE that is going to be a forced fail, or like you have to mash a button to resist this thing, and that's not going to work. But you still if it engages or not. Uncharted's another interesting. This all came out for a little bit. The
Last of Us 2.
The Last of Us 2 E3 demonstration, which was really getting close to. It was minimal UI too, but it was also like really hard to discern gameplay from cutscene.
Right, in a way is very impressive.
Which is good, yeah. Like if it's E3, so everything's usually souped up and built specifically to show off the systems. But that being said, if even the fact that they managed to make those sequences at all, I think is insane and be playable, because it was really hard to tell.
Yeah, and I mean, like I said, it's impressive, but it starts to raise questions about like what sort of control do we give players in these games? I
would be curious to watch those sequences and see just a trackpad of button presses.
Yeah,
what was happening?
That would be fascinating.
Like the scene in the trailer where you're hiding under a truck and someone's looking for you, and you see the footsteps come up, and then she bends down and you shoot the woman in the head, and the way that she God, this sounds horrible. The way she dies and falls was really impressive.
Yeah, very realistic.
Yeah, realistic maybe. But that's insane. Is that a good thing?
I mean, I think it's very difficult to accomplish, and they did a good job at it.
There we go. That's good. Technically sound.
It is, yeah. It's very technically sound.
If we're getting better at simulating murder, it's not quite as cool.
But
that's why Doom is so cool, right?
Yeah, well, Doom is really cool. I don't know if it's cool because it's such a good simulation of actually shooting aliens.
Shooting aliens on Mars?
Yeah, I mean, it is cool that they blow up
sometimes.
To be fair. What's that?
It's demons, not aliens.
Yeah, no, whatever. Demons.
Yeah,
it's true. You can blow up demons. It's okay.
It's hell on Mars.
Yeah. But
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, we don't really know what blowing up demons looks like.
that's true. Maybe it's a very accurate simulation.
Maybe it's exactly what it's like.
That's exactly what it's like. But also, like, Red Dead Redemption 2 is out, and, like,
Right.
it has very fine, detailed controls for looting things out of cupboards, right? You
Yeah.
actually have to bend down and pick something out.
But I find it's hysterical too. Like, that's gotten some flack from that.
Yeah. And
What little flack that game's gotten, like legitimate flack. I'm not talking all the bullshit. Can't say the N-word stuff, which is I'm not even gonna touch that. But,
Sure.
Actual flack. Like, it's actually gotten a little bit of pushback for being too, like, the word that got used, I think, were like unwieldy or
Clunky.
Yeah, clunky. Yeah, it's clunky.
Mm-hmm.
Which is hysterical because it's quite the opposite, actually, in some way. It might be slightly unwieldy, but certainly not clunky in terms of they've created such a realistic system.
Mm-hmm.
But then the question, clunkiness might come from the fact that we don't have a complex enough control scheme to go with it.
Yeah.
It might be clunky on a controller
Well, yeah, I think it probably is. I haven't
or
played...
keyboard or
I haven't played Red Dead Redemption 2 yet. I would love to. If anyone wants to, send me a PlayStation 4, I'd love to play. But I do think that one of the things people are getting at when they say it's clunky is that the level of detail in what you're doing is switching.
Sure.
Right? So
Sure.
you're
Yeah.
riding a horse.
Right.
What do you do to ride? Okay, so riding a horse is very complicated.
Takes a lot of balance.
I can't ride a horse.
I can't ride a horse like
But
that.
there's lots of people who can ride a horse in Red Dead Redemption 2 because all it takes is to use a joystick. Yeah, you can't trip over rocks or do anything stupid. I think that's cool.
Yeah.
But you aren't having to control individual reins with your hands.
Right.
Okay, let's talk about looting something from a cupboard. That's exactly what you're doing.
Right.
You're bending down, you've opened the cupboard, you're picking out individual items. The level of detail and what you're doing has totally switched.
It's QWOP. That's why QWOP sucked.
What was QWOP?
Remember QWOP?
No.
QWOP? It was the
the running game.
The running game. Yeah.
Yes.
It was just. It's obviously there's better ways to do QWOP than QWOP, but it's a decent way to show why mapping body parts to simple control is impossible. It's not the way.
And I think it can be a fun game, but when
It's just fun by itself, but that's a different game then.
Right, when you have a game where you're running around shooting, doing impromptu dialogue with people on the street, riding a horse, and then you have to loot a cupboard by picking up individual items with your hands,
Right.
that's really different.
And it's interesting too that like another thing that was so yeah, again, it just seems to be a very, very difficult line to find, like we were talking about earlier, in terms of how much is too much. Because like another thing, like so the writing in Witcher 3, right?
Mm-hmm.
Was widely praised in terms of. You remember that? Have you?
No.
Okay. You hop on Roach, your horse, and it's an auto ride basically, unless you can just literally do nothing.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're on a path on a road, Roach will just go down it.
Right,
And turn.
It seems
and
similar to the
move correctly.
cinematic mode from Red Dead Redemption 2.
Yeah, a little bit. And obviously you can take full control of them and get off, but
Sure.
or like go off the road and go around and stuff. But that was widely regarded as a great feature, was being able to put it on autopilot if you wanted to,
Mm-hmm.
and abstracting movement. Because like you can make a whole game that's just about moving, right?
You could.
Like movement.
Mm-hmm.
We tend to abstract movement entirely, particularly in third-person games like that, where it's just whatever you're doing for movement is in the left stick. If you're flying a plane, if you're riding a horse, if you're walking, if you're swimming,
Yeah.
it's all directional based, right?
Exactly, it's an abstraction of just moving somewhere.
Right. You could have, and that's important. That's a normal part of gaming that people expect and require. And when you push that a little bit too far, which is in this case reaching down to grab something in Red Dead, people push back against that. Or even just the level of detail that the horse has. Like to put up another equivocation, the Skyrim horse versus the Red Dead horse, right? Like
Okay.
I don't know if you've seen clips of you can trip. Your horse can trip in Red Dead, right?
Right.
Like it's really sensitive to where its legs are in the animation as you're running. It's not very. It's a very sandboxy thing that is in universe happening. As opposed to the Skyrim horse, it's like. I swear, like, it just keeps on doing checks. It's like, okay, can you exist in this place? Yes. Can you exist in this place? Yes. Then, like, we'll make an animation between these two places. Like, that is, like, moment to moment what's happening with Skyrim Horse. Like, you can literally climb mountains. Have you ever seen that, right?
Yeah.
Just the way
it's like a tank.
Yeah. It or it just goes through things or over things and is very non-specific to ledges and the way that animal would actually move in a lot of ways. It's more so just a hoverboard kind of that your character's on.
Sure.
And that, obviously has brought its own stuff, and yet that didn't get nearly. I don't know. It's really interesting. I don't know what that correct line is, because you want to have some. Do you want the experience of being a master horse rider where you can very easily navigate through things and the game does a little bit of that for you, or do you want to mess up a lot and have to learn how to ride a horse?
Right.
There's no answer to that.
No, I mean, it depends on the experience that you want to give the player.
Would Red Dead be a better game, one way or the other? I don't think so.
I think when you try to give people too many experiences, that can create a problem.
Sure.
You can play poker in Red Dead, and like that's fine. People like that.
Yeah.
And like little mini card games and things like that. But it's not core to the experience, right? You don't have to play poker. There may, as far as I know, there might be like one mission or something where you have to play poker. It's optional.
Right.
But I do think that some of the tension comes from these common abstractions that we built up around games. Movement is certainly one of them. We've talked about combat. That's another one.
Yep.
Exploration or just sort of discovery of something, probably.
Yeah.
And then role playing, and like those are abstractions you also see in D&D.
Right.
It's not unique to video games. It's sort of unique to role playing in general.
Yeah.
And when you start adding a lot of finicky details to those abstractions, you run into problems where you make some people unhappy because it's not the established abstractions.
Yeah.
Right? Like gaming is pretty old now,
right.
And there are clear ideas that have evolved of like these are the things that we care about as gamers, and when you start overloading those with like, okay, well now movement is going to involve making sure that you don't trip on your horse, and maybe maybe a bunch of other things. I don't know.
And you see the exact same thing in D&D actually as a system, right? There's been multiple editions of the game, and there's been multiple levels of intensity to the rule sets, right? The current one is actually pretty pared down, where it makes things very simple.
Mm-hmm.
You can give a whole lot of, and the other thing, right? You can give a whole lot of interesting description to what you're doing and the way you're doing it, and you can be very creative with the way you're doing it.
Mm-hmm.
But at the end of the day, the game itself, the core rule set's actually pretty darn simple. And the big, huge asterisk here for D&D is that you can change the rules whenever you want.
Sure.
They iterate that over and over. That's the whole point. But that's an interesting case study too, in terms of developing the rule set and what's happening in tandem.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like a DM that can change rules or create rules on the spot or develop rules out of necessity due to the player wanting to do something they can't currently do.
Sure.
And how those build on each other. Like it's not, with a game dev, you can't patch in real time.
Not while somebody's playing.
Yeah, but that's what you can do in D&D. You actually have a full one-to-one feedback loop in terms of things happening to the rules being made, to an extent, right?
Sure.
So that's another interesting maybe idea we could think about or roll with. But it does just seem to be a problem.
Yeah.
No matter how you slice it, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it is. I mean, it's difficult, but you're going to ruffle some feathers.
And there's no answer. Like I said, is Red Dead a better game for the fact that your horse can trip? It is what it is. It's a game. It's people will like that, and other people won't, depending on what you're looking for.
Right. Yeah, and the experience you want to give to the player.
Yeah.
And I would say that they were pretty clear about wanting to give you a very realistic experience of being in the West, the Wild West as an outlaw, and that's why it got flack about the N-word and all this other stuff.
Right.
Because they're like, oh, well, wasn't that realistic? But I think that it was what the designers wanted it to be, and I think I give a lot of credit for creative integrity if they stuck to what they wanted the game to be, and like if they wanted the horse to be able to trip because horses can actually trip, then fine.
Fun side note, actually, the whole WoW just I was reading recently on I think it was an Ask Reddit actually, probably because of Red Dead right now, but it was just asking how lawless the Old West actually was.
Sure.
And according to 40 minutes of reading I've done, which was looked pretty legit in terms of actual papers and historians and stuff. Mm-hmm. The whole American art that is not anywhere close to what the Old West was like.
I believe it.
We built a fantasy world actually. Red Dead didn't happen.
Huh.
It's really become a mythologized thing. It's a very recent version of mythology that's happened. And obviously there's kind
of like with pirates.
Yeah, very much so. Our whatever conception we think of the Rick and Morty where he's doing Pirates of the Pancreas.
No, yeah, I've seen it.
We didn't pull any punches, Morty. I'm not gonna lie, I made him super rapey. But yeah. So anyway, Red Dead. It's just funny when you were talking about like really trying to deliver an authentic experience. Like that, none of that was actually.
Yeah.
Probably that level of the way the world worked on the frontier.
Well, that's interesting too, right? Like. A level of like having a highly detailed game doesn't necessarily mean that you're mirroring something that really
it was real.
I think they wanted to capture what people thought the Old West would have been like.
Yeah, which is a fantasy by itself. Which then immediately undermines all of the idiots that are crying about historical accuracy in games, because you can just go ahead and take that,
read a history book
somewhere else. But yeah, that is interesting. It's literally just the conception of what we built.
Mm-hmm.
It to be, and apparently it delivered. That's a clear enough fantasy that it was able to be delivered well.
Sure.
People are like, no, this is a good version of that or a bad version of that.
Yeah, like it's that ingrained in like what people expect and have come to understand about the Old West.
Yeah,
and in that a lot of it has been built up through film. And through
exactly, just media.
Books and
same thing with the Dark Ages.
Sure,
medieval times, the way we conceptualize medieval fights.
Oh yeah,
fantasy fights.
We have no idea how medieval fights went down. Guys.
Actually, literally no.
We don't know how they used swords. We don't actually know how charges worked in armies.
Yeah.
Anyway, fun fact. This is real talk here.
Yeah.
But
there's a bunch of other things that are feel really intuitive that aren't at all. I was reading about particularly just the Gatling gun invention, and that there are that beginning of recording specifics about. Maybe not specifics, but getting real specific about the way, a single Gatling gun was able to turn back an army of, again, with terrain, multiple thousands of people.
Mm-hmm.
30, I think there was a garrison of 35 that turned back a 4,000 person army.
Yeah.
And that's just and intuitively that shouldn't make sense. They could just bum rush them, right?
Uh-huh.
No, apparently not.
No, they can't.
Apparently that did not happen. You know? So anyway,
we're getting into the weeds a little bit, but what can we say?
It's fun.
What can we say about
bring back to the cinematicness of games?
Yeah.
I think as with many things we come to in this particular discussion, it really depends. I think a big huge thing that you hit on early on was that the difference in the level of complexity the games are able to give without having further control scheme complexity.
Mm-hmm.
I think is really important. Or particularly for these kind of third-person story-based or narrative-based action games.
Oh yeah.
Because I do agree, Ty. I think that I think that the Arkham system is lazy. Critique is lazy by itself. Actually, it sounds like someone who actually didn't learn the system, or has thought about it for a little bit and is it looks like you can only hit 2 buttons. But I think there is a level of danger that comes from over movieatizing games.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know where that is.
Yeah.
I don't know where that line is. I think it's kind of annoying when you see it and feel it, sort of thing.
Yeah. When you take control away from the player too much, it does start to ruin the experience of playing a game as opposed to watching a movie.
Yeah.
But
if you really want to be doing complex things in the game, you need to be able to give them control.
Mm-hmm.
In the first place, to not take away control, you need to be able to have them control correctly.
Yeah.
You need a sufficient control
scheme.
You need
a control scheme that will fit that. And I don't have a solution to this problem, but I do have a prediction, which is that the game industry has demonstrated, without doubt, that it is much more excited about innovating level of detail graphically than it is about changing its control scheme.
Well,
and so I think we're going to see a lot more games.
Unless you're Nintendo.
Yeah, well, and those haven't particularly gone well. You can see our review of Mario Galaxy 2.
Yeah.
But I do have to give them credit that they were trying.
No, I do.
And I think we're going to get to a point where it does start to feel cinematic and people will get sort of frustrated with the disparity between what you can do as a gamer and what the player what the character on the screen is doing.
Can do.
And eventually that's going to hit a tipping point where we have to innovate our control scheme. And it could be that the innovation comes through VR and that we're able to do things with our hands and that gives us a sufficiently analog control scheme instead of the more digital one that we have now.
And to be fair, too, I also want to call into... I think there's a level of either just misguidedness or just laziness on developers' parts, which is the control scheme to make Normandy. We have the control scheme to make Normandy feel tense.
Sure.
Right. We had that like years and years ago. So there is like a failing, I think, of the Call of Duty current one that didn't take advantage of what it could have been. Right?
Absolutely.
So it's not just a matter of we don't have the complexity to do it. I think there is a level of like respect gamers more a little bit. Like
yeah, a little too much hand holding.
Yeah. Like narratively in a movie, it'd be like respecting your audience to put things together, like showing not telling. Or showing not telling. And similarly for like a game, it'd be like to let your player play the part and make sure they can get through it.
Yeah.
And believe that they can, rather than just doing it for them.
Yeah, I think that's great. Like believing in your audience as a game designer.
Yeah.
Like believe that that the gamers will want to figure out what you're trying to do and will want to do it and will want to do it well.
In terms of respecting your audience, Dark Souls is the classic version of that in terms of difficulty. But Dark Souls is also very, like when we're talking about combat systems particularly, we talked about Dark Souls, it's again, it's interesting because its inputs are simple as well. There's like a roll button, a strike button, a block button.
Heavy, you can jump back, you can parry.
Yeah.
That's pretty much it.
5 or 6, I guess.
Yeah.
But that's praised, but it's a lot more direct. It's a lot more. That one's praised a lot in terms of its depth and the amount of control you have and the complexity of it. It really does feel like you're controlling your character in 3 dimensions.
Yeah.
And how you do there's no like, Well, it's also not too cinematic, right?
Notice
you always just slash something to death.
Yeah, exactly.
You never have these cool sync kills.
Well, notice what's done with what they've done too. Is like we talked about maybe the 4, there could be 5 like major abstractions in role playing.
Right.
They've taken one of those and devoted 90% of the controls to that one abstraction.
You can't do anything else.
Because they've really wanted it to be about combat, and you're not trying to also do movement and also do puzzle solving.
That's a good point.
And a bunch of other things. It's the controller is dedicated to
the entirety
fighting.
of this. Yeah.
And you can fight everything in the game,
there's
including
like
the NPCs.
There's like almost no platforming or puzzle solving or
no.
The whole game is just designed around the difficulty of encounters.
Exactly. And so I think you're able to give a really compelling level of depth for that one thing that you focused on, which is combat.
Yeah.
And if you wanted to pick a game where you gave a really compelling depth to movement, you could.
Right.
I think you could, but you just couldn't also have combat on that same control scheme and have it feel like it fits.
And hence the problem with Arkham being Batman does more than just fights.
Right.
They've tried to put in their major things for traversal, combat, stealth.
And so you end up with some
and then some puzzle solving
switching
as well. Yeah.
So you
just don't have enough buttons.
Well, yeah, but then you end up with different modes, right?
Different
mode.
Yeah.
You could be in the Batmobile. All your controls switch. But I do think that's a little bit more jarring, and it starts to feel like you're playing different games every time you're in a different mode.
And that was another thing that, particularly with Batmobile, was, at least as Batman in general, a lot of your controls are pretty darn similar between modes. In the Batmobile, you have a whole new control scheme. In fact, you have 2 modes in the Batmobile, and people were like, yeah, it just feels like they did a different game.
Right.
Like, on top of it, which was cool, but it just wasn't. And that was another critique of Knight, at least the last one in the series. But no, that's a great point. And yeah, I think the Dark Souls example is interesting in terms of it was celebrated hugely. Is that a word?
Hugely.
I think it's a word.
I don't know.
It's better than bigly. Anyway, it was a series that very much respected it, or even like games like Odyssey, right? Like a lot of those, or just any of the
that's a good example of movement pretty much being the entire control scheme.
And as far as I know, that game also there's very little cinematicness to it. I suppose it's not cinematic in terms of
it looks good, but there aren't a lot of cutscenes.
Yeah, or rather, there's almost no instances of press X to do this thing.
Yeah. Right.
X does a thing, and then you do a thing by pressing buttons.
Right.
Not the other way around. But again, that system is just moving. That's interesting.
They've only expanded.
So maybe hybrid games, more clear role-play games, are just really. There's a lot of systems that go into role-play, and that's hard to do.
It's hard to do with a simple control scheme. I'm not necessarily sure that a more complex control scheme is the answer, because those can be have a steep learning curve. So I'm not quite sure what the answer is here. But anyway, I think
You just have to use your words.
Yeah, D&D is pretty great.
You have all the complexity with structure, and then freedom to modify the structure.
Hey.
So, if you want true role playing, that is. I finally elevated into nerddom to the level where I consider role playing to mean tabletop role, like in the original sense. Like RPGs, video game RPGs are like different. That's not even.
That's not real role playing.
Not really.
Oh my gosh.
I'm joking.
All right. Well,
sweet.
See you later.
Peace.
If you have thoughts about
Oh yeah.
Red Dead Redemption 2, The Last of Us 2, simulation, video games, any of this stuff, control schemes, you can email Muxl at gergandmuxl.com. You can email Gerg at gergandmuxl.com. That will get to Mark or Greg respectively. And we will see you next time.
Peace.
Our next game that we're streaming is unknown at the moment.
Oh, okay.
we will be streaming another game next week, so stay tuned.